The whole thing started with a garden hose. Yeah, seriously, a garden hose. And if you had driven through Maple Glen that afternoon, you probably would have thought it was just another quiet Saturday in one of those neighborhoods where people wave at each other but secretly keep score over who belongs there and who doesn't. Except this time, somebody pushed things way too far. I still remember the sound first. Not the yelling, not the crying, but the smack of water hitting wedding cake and folding chairs while everybody just stood there frozen like their brains couldn't catch up with what was happening. And the woman holding that hose. She looked proud of herself. That's the part one still can't shake. Her name was Sharon Whitaker, early 60s maybe, always dressed like she was on her way to a country club brunch nobody invited the rest of us to, blonde bob haircut sprayed stiff against the Georgia humidity, pearls around her neck even when she was gardening. Sharon had lived on that street longer than almost anyone else, and she carried herself like she owned every blade of grass in the subdivision. The crazy part is, if you only met her for 5 minutes at the grocery store, you'd probably think she was sweet. She had that church smile thing down perfectly, but people who lived near her knew better. Especially the Alvarez family 2 houses down. See, Maple Glen had been changing over the years, slowly, naturally. Younger families moving in, different cultures, different music drifting through open windows during summer nights. Kids playing basketball in driveways instead of sitting inside glued to tablets. Most people adjusted. Sharon never did. She complained about everything. Too much noise, too many cars parked outside, food smells coming from cookouts. One time she called the HOA because Mr. Alvarez had hung Puerto Rican flags at his daughter's graduation party. Said it was making the neighborhood look political. Nobody took her seriously anymore, but she kept trying. And then came the wedding. Mateo Alvarez was getting married to his fiancée, Naomi Brooks, in his parents' backyard. Nothing extravagant, just close family and friends, string lights hanging between trees, trays of homemade food lining folding tables, kids running around with lemonade cups spilling everywhere. Honestly, it was beautiful because it felt real. You could tell every person there actually loved the couple. Mateo had this calm energy about him too, one of those guys who never raised his voice even when people gave him reasons to. Tall, clean-cut, always polite. He worked long hours downtown, kept mostly to himself, helped his parents fix up their house on weekends. Sharon hated him for reasons nobody fully understood. Maybe because he never reacted to her. People like Sharon feed off reactions. Mateo never gave her one. Around 4 in the afternoon, right when the ceremony was about 15 minutes away from starting, Sharon walked out onto the side of her property carrying a glass of white wine and already looking irritated. At first, everybody ignored her because, well, they were used to her hovering around the fence any time the Alvarez family had people over. But then she climbed onto this little gardening step stool near the hedges and yelled, "Hey, how long is this circus supposed to last?" The music stopped almost immediately. Naomi's little niece actually jumped. Mateo walked toward the fence with both hands raised slightly, like he was approaching a scared animal. "Ma'am," he said real calm. "We'll keep the music down, I promise. Ceremony's starting soon." Sharon laughed, but not the normal kind. It was sharp, ugly. "You think putting on a tux makes you classy?" she snapped. "This whole block smells like discount cologne and barbecue smoke." A couple people started muttering under their breath, but Mateo stayed composed. "We sent invitations to every house last month," he told her. "You could have just asked us directly if there was an issue." And that's when her face changed. Like something underneath finally cracked open. "I don't read junk mail from people who don't belong here," she said. Dead silence. Naomi looked down at the ground. Mateo's mother, Elena, who had spent all morning cooking for 2 straight days without sleeping much, slowly stepped forward and said quietly, "Please, today is important for our family." Sharon looked Elena up and down with this cold little smirk that honestly made my stomach turn. "Important," she said. "Honey, the only place you belong at a party like this is carrying trays back to the kitchen." You could feel the air leave the yard. Even the kids stopped moving. Mateo's jaw tightened for half a second. Just half a second. Then he exhaled and said, "That's enough." But Sharon wasn't done. Not even close. Sharon stepped down off the stool real slow, like she was enjoying the attention now, like every pair of eyes in that backyard was feeding something bitter inside her that had probably been growing for years. "Oh, don't give me that tone," she snapped at Mateo, pointing a manicured finger through the fence. You people move in here and suddenly everybody else has to adjust to your music, your parties, your mess. She took another sip of wine and shook her head. This neighborhood used to be respectable. Now, here's the thing nobody outside Maple Glen understood about Sharon Whitaker. She wasn't just some random rude neighbor. Her husband Richard had been one of the original developers who helped build half the subdivision back in the late 90s. After he passed away, Sharon held on to that history like it made her queen of the entire block. She acted like every new family moving in was personally erasing her husband's legacy. Doesn't excuse anything she did, obviously, but people don't become that angry overnight. Sometimes bitterness just sits in somebody too long and turns into poison. Still, none of us expected what happened next. Elena Alvarez tried one more time to calm things down. She walked toward the fence carefully, hands trembling a little, and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, we don't want problems. We're just trying to celebrate our son." And Sharon looked right at her and said, "Then celebrate somewhere your kind actually fits in." Naomi burst into tears instantly. One of the bridesmaids cursed under her breath. Somebody near the back yelled, "Yo, enough already." But before anyone could move, Sharon reached down, grabbed the garden hose beside her hydrangeas, and jerked the nozzle open full blast. Water exploded across the fence. Plates crashed. Cupcakes flipped off trays. Flower arrangements collapsed sideways onto the grass. And then the wedding cake. This huge 3-tier cake Naomi's aunt had spent 2 days decorating by hand. The water hit it dead center, and the whole thing sagged sideways like melting snow. You could actually hear people gasp. Sharon laughed. I swear to God she laughed. "There," she yelled over the screaming. "Maybe now this place won't smell like a flea market." Naomi covered her mouth and started sobbing into her maid of honor's shoulder. Elena stood there completely frozen, mascara running down her face. Mateo didn't move at first. That's what shocked me most. Most men would have lost their minds right there. But he just stared at the ruined table, blinking slowly, like he was trying to keep one part of himself from slipping loose. Then Sharon made the mistake that changed everything. She pulled out her phone. "You know what?" she said loudly. "I'm done playing nice." She marched back toward her patio while dialing. "Hello, 911. Yes, there's a hostile group gathering behind my property. I feel threatened. There are aggressive men yelling at me." Everybody could hear her because she wanted us to hear. "I think there may be gang activity involved." Gang activity. You should have seen Mateo's face when she said that. Not anger exactly, disappointment. Deep disappointment. Like he'd spent years hoping maybe she'd eventually see them as human beings, and in one sentence, she proved she never would. A few people started shouting back at her then. Naomi's cousin Andre yelled, "You're the one attacking people." Another guest pulled out his phone to start recording. Sharon pointed at him and shouted, "Good. Record it. Show everyone what kind of trash moved into this neighborhood." Then she sat down on her patio chair with this smug little smile, crossing her legs like the show was over and she'd won. The backyard looked destroyed. Wet napkins stuck to the grass, chairs knocked over, frosting sliding down tablecloths in thick white streaks. Naomi disappeared inside the house crying. Elena kept apologizing to guests even though none of this was her fault. And Mateo? He just stood there staring at the fence quietly while water dripped from his tuxedo sleeves. One of his groomsmen walked over and muttered, "Bro, say the word." Mateo shook his head immediately. "No," she crossed every line. "I know. Then why are you still protecting her?" Mateo looked over toward Sharon's house for a long second before answering. "Because some people are waiting their whole lives for an excuse to call you dangerous." Man, when he said that, the entire mood changed. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a rude neighbor anymore. You could feel years of swallowed anger sitting underneath that sentence. And honestly, that's when I started realizing there was probably way more to Mateo than anybody on that street understood. About 10 minutes later, the police finally arrived. 2 squad cars rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing against the parked cars outside the wedding. Sharon practically jumped out of her chair, trying to wave them down first. "Officers," she shouted dramatically. "Thank God you're here." She hurried down her driveway, pointing toward the Alvarez house before the cops even stepped out fully. "These people threaten me. They've been harassing the neighborhood for months, and I think some of them may be armed." Armed? Another lie. One of the younger officers glanced toward the backyard looking confused because honestly, It looked more like a ruined family barbecue than a criminal operation. Kids were still standing around holding wet juice boxes. An old man was trying to rescue aluminum trays from the grass. Somebody's grandmother was picking flowers out of a puddle. But then the oldest officer froze. Just completely stopped moving for a second. His expression changed instantly the moment he spotted Mateo walking out from the side gate. Mateo adjusted his soaked tux jacket calmly and started toward them. The officer removed his hat so fast, it almost looked automatic. "Captain Reyes," he said under his breath. The younger officers straightened immediately. One of them actually muttered, "No way." Sharon blinked hard. "Captain," she repeated, confused. Mateo stopped a few feet away from her. Calm. Controlled. Almost too calm. "Afternoon, Officer Daniels," he said. Daniels looked embarrassed. "Sir, nobody informed us this was your wedding." Sharon looked back and forth between them like her brain physically couldn't process what she was hearing. "Wait, what do you mean, Captain?" Mateo finally turned toward her fully. "My name is Mateo Reyes," he said evenly. "I oversee the Metro South Precinct." And just like that, every ounce of color drained out of Sharon Whitaker's face. For a second, nobody said anything. You could literally hear water dripping off the folding tables. Sharon just stood there blinking, her mouth slightly open, still clutching that wine glass like maybe if she held on to it hard enough this whole thing would somehow turn back in her favor. But it was over. You could feel it. The power in the situation had shifted so completely, it almost made the air feel heavier. Officer Daniels cleared his throat awkwardly and looked at the destroyed wedding setup. "Sir, do you want us to start taking statements?" Mateo didn't answer right away. He looked past the officers toward the backyard where Naomi was standing in the doorway now, mascara smeared, holding her ruined bouquet against her chest. And the look on his face right there. Honestly, that's the part one still think about the most. Not anger, not revenge, just exhaustion. Like this wasn't the first time he'd had to stay calm while somebody tried to strip his dignity away in public. Mateo finally nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Document everything." Sharon suddenly snapped back to life. "Now hold on a second," she blurted out, her voice climbing an octave. "You can't seriously be taking their side." Daniels looked at her carefully. "Ma'am, you admitted to spraying private property and filing an emergency report under false claims." "I was threatened." "By who?" he asked flatly. Sharon pointed wildly toward the backyard. "Them. Look at them. And that right there." That sentence hit harder than she probably intended because everybody knew what she actually meant. Not what they did. What they looked like. Officer Daniels glanced around slowly at the soaked decorations, crying family members, overturned food trays. Then he looked back at Sharon. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I see a wedding." Sharon's face tightened instantly. "Oh, don't start acting politically correct with me too." One of the younger officers quietly started photographing the damage while another spoke with guests near the fence. Naomi finally walked down the patio steps toward Mateo, her dress stained with muddy water near the hem. "Hey," she whispered softly, touching his arm. And man, the way his entire posture softened when he looked at her, it was like watching somebody finally breathe again after holding tension in their chest for hours. "I'm sorry," he told her. "Don't," Naomi said immediately. "None of this is your fault." But you could tell part of him believed it was. That's what happens when somebody spends years trying to be perfect so people won't stereotype them. Eventually, you start feeling responsible for other people's hatred too. Sharon folded her arms tighter. "This is unbelievable," she muttered. Richard would never have allowed this neighborhood to turn into. She stopped herself, but too late. Mateo looked directly at her. "Into what?" Sharon didn't answer, because there was no clean version of the sentence sitting in her head. Officer Daniels stepped closer with a notepad. "Mrs. Whitaker, based on witness statements and the recordings several guests provided, will likely be forwarding charges for property destruction, false emergency reporting, and possible harassment violations." "Harassment?" Sharon scoffed. "I've lived here 23 years. Mateo nodded slightly. "Yeah," he said. "And every complaint you filed against my family for the last 4 years came across my desk." Her eyes widened. "What?" "Noise complaints during daytime hours. False reports about suspicious vehicles. Claims my father was intimidating residents because he parked his work truck outside overnight." Sharon's confidence started cracking visibly now. I didn't know." Mateo gave this tired little laugh, but there wasn't humor in it. That's kind of the point, isn't it? Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the officers stayed quiet because deep down, everybody knew this conversation wasn't really about one ruined wedding anymore. It was about all the little humiliations people justify when they think nobody important is watching. Mateo looked around at the damaged decorations, the soaked family photos laid out on one of the tables, the half-destroyed cake collapsing into itself. Then he said something I don't think Sharon expected to hear. "You know what's crazy?" he said softly. "If you had walked over here today and just asked politely to lower the music, we would have done it immediately." Sharon looked away. "But you didn't want quiet," Mateo continued. "You wanted control." That one landed hard. You could see it in her face. Because the truth has a way of sounding louder when everybody around you already knows it's true. Naomi squeezed Mateo's hand gently and said, "Come on, let's finish this day our way." And thankfully, he listened. The officers stayed behind collecting statements while guests slowly started rebuilding what they could. Neighbors from farther down the street actually began showing up carrying extra food, folding chairs, even flowers from their own yards. One older white couple brought over a fresh cake from a nearby bakery without saying much besides, "Nobody should end their wedding like this." And honestly, that part almost made me cry more than the confrontation itself, because for the first time all day, the neighborhood actually felt like a community instead of divided territory. Around sunset, the ceremony finally happened. Not the way they planned it, not polished, not perfect, but maybe better in some strange way because everybody standing there understood exactly what love looks like when it survives humiliation without turning cruel in return. String lights reflected off puddles in the grass, while Mateo and Naomi exchanged vows surrounded by people who chose kindness after every reason not to. And Sharon? She watched the whole thing alone from behind her screened porch, lights off inside her house, silhouette barely visible through the mesh. I remember wondering whether she felt ashamed or just angry that things didn't go the way she imagined. Honestly, I still don't know. And maybe that's why this story stuck with me so long. Because it forces you to ask something uncomfortable. When people show you who they are during moments where they think they have power over others, should they be forgiven once the power disappears? Or does the apology only come after consequences finally show up at the front door? I want to know what you think. Was Sharon just a lonely, bitter woman holding on to a past she couldn't let go of? Or did she deserve everything that happened after that host touched the wedding table? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe respect shouldn't depend on somebody's job title, skin color, or zip code, hit subscribe, because stories like this happen way more often than people want to admit.